So here I want to go over an approach to ACT English questions that give you a bunch of words and a bunch of what I'll call slots or positions where you may or may not have a comma, like that one, this one, etc., and go over an approach to these questions. And I've squiggled out the other ones because the ACT people are very, very strict in terms of prohibiting people from using their questions. But I've put a disclaimer in the description below, and I'm not using more than 10% of any of these tests. I'm taking isolated questions from very different, distinct tests. Okay, so number 32 here. This question gives a lot of students a lot of trouble. Bobbing up and down in the East River are several well-preserved 19th century multi-masted schooners. So a whole lot of words there. And what I would say in this case is that we have multiple slots. Again, that's going to be a recurring theme throughout the examples in this video. We have three slots, three places where there either might or might not be a comma. And what I want to emphasize here is that the best way to go about these questions is generally to go one slot at a time, starting with the one that you feel the most confident about. And in this case, I would say that the ones that I would want to start with would either be the yellow or the blue. I would not want to start with the green because I think that is the most subtle. It's the hardest to explain in terms of why you would or would not want the comma there. And what we're going to find is usually you don't even need to worry about the most difficult slot on a question like this because focusing on the others will sort of take care of it for you. In this case, several, blah, 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 blah. Well, what is several? Several is an article, much like the or a. And so here I'm just going to do a little color coding. These colors aren't going to necessarily match, but a big chair. Okay, so a is an article just like several is an article. Big is an adjective just like well-preserved and 19th century are. And then I'm going to say that multi-masted schooners is one thing. Kind of like an office chair. And maybe we could say, okay, we have a big, expensive office chair. Okay, so we've got two adjectives there. But again, the question of whether you want to put a comma in between those can get subtle depending on the particular example. But what you're never going to have is you're never going to have a comma in between an article like a or several and then an adjective. And if we look down at this and say, oh, we don't want that comma, that's actually going to allow us to eliminate all three of the wrong answers. So we don't even need to make a decision about the blue slot, let alone the green slot. Our correct answer is going to have to be J. And that is what I mean when I say go one slot at a time. Now let's look at a few more examples to reinforce this idea. Okay, at Edinburgh's Filmhouse Cinema, a three-dimensional sculpted scene, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this one's a little bit different in that we definitely do want to put a comma there because that comma is going to have the effect of sort of separating that introductory prepositional phrase from the rest of the sentence. So at Edinburgh's Filmhouse Cinema, so here we can say we definitely do want a comma after cinema so we can eliminate H and J, excuse me. What do we have left? A three-dimensional sculpted blank. Okay, three-dimensional sculpted scene. Well, sculpted scene, is that like office chair? I would say that it kind of is. Sculpted scene. But regardless, if you want to think of sculpted as an adjective that is modifying the noun scene, you're definitely not going to put a comma there. Likewise, if you wanted to think of it as a single noun, kind of like office chair, a sculpted scene, well, you're still not going to put a comma in between office and chair. You're not going to put a comma in between sculpted and scene, and that takes care of that. And I think, again, the hardest one to make a decision on would be that. Is it a three-dimensional sculpted scene or a three-dimensional, sculpted scene? You don't want to get hung up on that because, again, chances are that's not going to be the deciding factor on a question like this. And let's look at one more example that is perhaps similar to the first one. For this challenge, 10 8-foot wide red weather balloons were delivered. Okay, There's a lot going on there. But 10, I mean, is 10 an article? I don't know, but it's kind of like, a or several, 10. Okay, we're not going to put a comma right after 10. Just like we wouldn't put a comma right after a or right after several. Unfortunately, that only allows us to get rid of one option, but still, it's one option that we can get rid of. Okay, what about the rest of this? Well, weather balloons definitely does function in much the same way as office chair or jet engine does. So weather balloons. Okay, what does that mean? Well, first of all, we definitely don't want a comma in between weather and balloons, just like we wouldn't want a comma in between office and chair. But given that this is essentially acting as a single noun, we also don't want a comma to go right before it. Just like you wouldn't put a comma in between red and chair. You wouldn't say it's a red comma chair, you would say it's a red chair. You wouldn't say it's a red comma office chair, you would say it's a red office chair. Red weather balloons. So we don't want a comma to go here. And what does that take care of? It takes care of the remaining option. And so a recurring theme on a lot of these questions is that the correct answer will end up being one without any additional punctuation. Not always the case, because sometimes there will be a need for a comma, but they like giving these questions in which the adjectives sort of pile up on one another, but upon closer inspection, you don't need the commas. So don't feel like, hey, I got to put a comma somewhere. You don't always have to put a comma somewhere. It really depends on the situation. And just to hammer that home, let's look at one more example. I think this is one other one that has caused some problems for students. I apologize that it is, speaking of tilted here on the page. But it says here, once the story is solid, I swivel my chair around and face the gleaming white surface of my tilted drawing table. Okay, so remember, the theme here is one slot at a time. So there's a slot. There's a slot. And there's a slot. And again, what I call a slot is just a place in the answer choices where there is some difference, where there is some distinction between at least one option and the remaining options. Okay, so where do we want to start here? Well, I would say, let's start with the green one. You can start wherever you want it, but drawing table. Drawing table is a lot like, well, it's a lot like multi-masted schooner, but it's a lot like office chair. Drawing table. It's a single thing. Drawing table. Okay, so just like, again, we wouldn't want to say a red comma office chair. We wouldn't want to say a tilted comma drawing table. So that means we can get rid of two options. We can get rid of A, and we can get rid of C. What is left here? Well, we've got our red slot and our blue slot, but I would say that we definitely do not want to put a comma in between white and surface, because surface is a noun and white is an adjective. So we don't want that comma, and we can get rid of B. And so what does that mean? It means that we don't have to make a decision. We don't have to make a decision about this. Is it a gleaming comma white surface, or is it a gleaming white surface? I think that is very subtle, but again, the nice thing about these questions is when it gets down to those really subtle distinctions, you don't have to make that decision. Now, for those who might be interested in getting into some of these nuances a little bit more, I'll direct your attention to a post that I found very helpful on this topic, and it is here. So, Grammar Girl. Commas with adjectives. Comma or no comma. And the distinction here has to do with what they call coordinate adjectives versus cumulative adjectives. And the rule of thumb here is that if you can reverse the order of the adjectives without significantly changing the meaning of what you're saying, then yes, you do use an adjective. A heavy, bulky box and a bulky, heavy box makes sense. In contrast, something like deep religious experience, well, it wouldn't make sense to reverse the order of the adjectives there. A religious deep experience is not the same thing as a deep religious experience. Since you can't reverse the adjectives without changing the meaning, you wouldn't want to put a comma in there. See, that doesn't work. And so, as it says here, use commas when you could use and, like a heavy and bulky box, or when you could reverse the order of the adjectives like bulky, heavy box, heavy, bulky box. Don't use a comma when you couldn't use and, like deep and religious experience, or when you couldn't reverse the order of the adjectives. But again, to bring it back to the ACT, you generally don't have to make that distinction, especially if you focus on going one slot at a time. That should take care of things before you even get to that distinction between coordinate and accumulative adjectives.